Mr. President, I would encourage you to have a seat and get comfortable. I've got some things I'd like to talk about when it comes to this bill. When we look at the various resources our state has to offer, and they are plentiful, and we look at probably one of the better educated, more engaged, voting, civilly active in our nonprofits and our organizations. It's a pretty amazing thing we have here in Minnesota that's easy to take for granted. And I think there's been many times that we have taken some of those things for granted. And I would say that this bill represents that. Now, let me be clear. The leadership, I think, Senator Fishbach showed within the framework that she was given, I think is probably about as good of a bill as she could eke out. And I don't fault her for that. I appreciate her passion for our education, and I really believe she wants to see a stronger, more robust higher education system in Minnesota. What I reject is the premise the framework was in the first place. I reject the premise of the framework that said we were locked within these parameters. Now, I've made this argument, gosh, I don't know, 1,000 times on the floor when it comes to the overall global budget targets and what we had and how much we could spend on different things. And I have passionately tried to really instill this idea that we have a system that's really set up that its only outcome is to make Minnesota better. And on top of that, it provides for an amazing ROI on the investment. Yet, despite that, and much to my disappointment, the governor apparently signed off on this agreement. Despite that, we continue to create what I feel is a punitive approach to our higher education system, and this bill particularly punitive to the University of Minnesota. Now, I realize it's going to be pretty tough. It's a pretty big haul for me, a pretty heavy lift for me to believe that I'm going to convince people here to take a stand when I have not been able to do so far, especially if the governor and leadership has signed off on a bill. But that's exactly what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask you to take a second and think about what we're doing with this bill. Think about what message it sends to our kids, what message it sends to the middle class, what message it sends to the really wonderful educators that work every day to try to make our state better by educating the young people in Minnesota. What message are we sending about our culture as a state? We have an opportunity this year to right the wrongs, to fix the cuts of 2011. Now, maybe it was necessary because we were in a recession. I get that. But we have historic cuts that we cut deep into the tissue of our higher education system in 2011, and now we're in a position where we can make some of that ground back up and reinvest right before the idea that we might have another recession, and really invest in our schools. And instead, we're going to double down on the same rhetoric and the same ideas. Now, granted, and I give Senator Fishbach credit, we put more money into it, and I think that's good. But if you understand the situation on the ground at the schools, understand the situation of the crushing student debt we're facing, understanding the rising, spiraling tuition costs, it doesn't matter that we threw a little at it, because it wasn't nearly enough for what needed to happen to maintain our schools at the levels that we want. And that's what's frustrating to me. Again, I say this, and I don't know if I can say it enough times. The only outcome of higher education is a better state. I'm not sure there are many things that an investment makes our state better so directly as investing in higher education, and the result is an educated populace. This bill looks backwards and not forwards, not because there wasn't some initial investment in the bill, but because it doesn't take into account that we're not even taking care of right now. We're still making up for before, and we're not even looking forward to what we've got in 4 years from now. We've got a global economy, folks. We're in the middle of a pseudo kind of manufacturing renaissance, and we can't find people to work the jobs. That's a problem, because they're not trained. They don't have what they need to be successful. And we're saying with this bill, we're not going to fix that. Folks, the premise that this framework of the targets, the global targets, the premise of the framework of what we're spending our money on was flawed from the beginning. Now, I realize my friends across the aisle, and I call them friends because I have had a really good time getting to know people on the other side of the aisle, came here with a promise about tax cuts. And I get it. You got to live up to your promise. We say something, we got to be to our word. But I think that when you get here and you see the nuts and bolts of how we make laws, of how we affect people's lives, we got to ask ourselves a question: what's best for Minnesota? Unfortunately, this bill isn't, and allow me to explain why. Let's start with MnState. So MnState comes to us with an ask that's about $25 million or $20 million less than what they actually need. They came to us and said, this is what we need, and we're also going to tell you we're willing to take a $20 million cut and absorb it within the schools. We're going to take a $20 million cut and absorb it within the schools. So they came in with good faith, gave an honest request, and we're coming in way short of what they asked for. Why is that significant? It's bargaining, right? That's how it works. You come in high, they come in low, and you meet somewhere in the middle. The problem is that works when you're sitting in like your standard operating procedures, when everything's kind of normal. The reality is that's not where we're sitting. Listen, I teach at these schools. I watch the janitor's hours get cut. I watch less supplies be there. But more importantly, I watch less activities happen. Now we're changing the culture of education in our schools, and this is where it starts. Research has conclusively shown, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that when a student is engaged in extracurricular activities, they are going to have a better GPA and a better chance of graduating. This bill does not help enhance that. This bill steps backwards on that. Not to mention, in general, the loss of funding that's going to be created and the amount of cuts we're going to ask them to absorb. And on top of that, we still have a tuition freeze in there. Folks, I get it. It's a sexy, great topic on the campaign trail. Man, I froze tuition. I get it. It sounds good in the soundbite. But look at what you're doing on the ground in the schools. I'm working on staying forward. It's hard for me to do that. Look at what we're doing on the ground in the schools. This tuition freeze ties their hands behind their back, and it's going to remove the ability of them to provide what they need. Folks, allow me to flip the script for a second. Imagine instead of saying, you know what, we're going to just try to balance this with everything else, we say, let's go all in on education. Let's look at and invest in what jobs are coming down the pipeline in the next 10 years, and let's get our schools situated to meet that demand. This bill doesn't do any of that. What I just said is common sense and should be the norm on how we approach education. Period. Again, I'm going to say it. The outcome of higher education makes our state better, and this bill doesn't enhance that. That's a problem. I'm going to tell you a couple stories about a few students that I know that are going to be affected by this bill. A couple years ago, I had a student come in who was living in a hotel, recently homeless, missing, I'd say, 2/3 of her teeth, trying to make an honest effort in her 30s to figure some things out and take a stab at making her life better, not only for her, but her daughter, who was also going there. She had a tough circumstance in life, and I could see that life had not been easy for her. But she had somehow found her way to the doors of Century College. And I worked with her, and I'll tell you what, she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to take on the role of a college student, but she had the desire and the drive and the willingness to do whatever it took. So I suggested tutoring. I suggested going to the Access Center and getting support, whatever that support needed, financial aid support, psychological support, whatever you needed to get you through to the next day to show up to class. And I will never forget, third test of the year, she comes into me and she's crying. And she hands me the test back. She got a B, and she had never got a B before. That changed her life. I remember being in an alternative high school as a person with a 1.1 or 1.2 GPA, getting my first good grade at an alternative high school, and how that opened the world to me. We're making it with this bill so less of those students come in the door. I have another student. After the Arab Spring, emigrated from a Middle Eastern country, had been a successful business person there with a family, degrees, the whole 9 yards, and lost all of it in the Arab Spring. Had to start over. Came here and understood that life is hard and sometimes not fair, put his boots back on, and realized the first thing he's got to do is get better at English and get a degree so he can go on and find a job. Suffered through my class, struggled through my class, trying to get English down, studied hard, did extra homework the whole 9 yards, got out of there with a C. I'm not an easy grader, folks. Got out of there with a C. And that was a C he had earned. No questions asked. Solid. I didn't give him anything. We're making it harder for that person to come here and experience the American dream when you leave persecution and you leave a bad place for something better, which is what America's supposed to be, and we're making that harder with this bill. I can't even tell you the number of times teaching at Century College, which, by the way, is literally the most honorable and wonderful thing I've had the opportunity to do, that I've had students like the two I just shared with you. I have 1,000 stories like that I shared with you, who had the opportunity to come in and see a better life. But more importantly, I had the opportunity to help them see the better life they could make for themselves. But you know what? This bill is going to make sure there's less people like me there teaching, because there's going to be less class and less teachers. So again, we have failed. Shame on us, shame on the governor, shame on everybody involved by accepting this framework, because this bill is flawed and does not make Minnesota a better place. It sets us backwards. Let's talk about the University of Minnesota for a second. I have to work hard to be rational when I talk about what we're doing to them in this bill. Min-State's bad enough with the tuition freezes and the nominal increases, or not even getting close to what they need to continue to operate, this pretending like inflation doesn't exist. MnSCU is bad enough, but what we're doing to the U, that's unconscionable. It's been said many times before, and I'll say it again. The University of Minnesota is a crown jewel, not just in Minnesota, but for our country. It produces Nobel laureates. It produces some of the greatest minds and some of the biggest solutions. I said it before, and I'm going to tell you the story again. I have a friend that has a kind of cancer that only 17 people in the world have. And wouldn't you know that the person who specializes in fixing this cancer is at the University of Minnesota? Wouldn't you know my best friend, and I was the best man in his wedding, is around today with his kids, working hard and enjoying life, because the specialist he needed was right there at the University of Minnesota. What we're doing makes that happen less. They're already losing research scholars because of the crazy politics we're playing up here on fetal cell tissue research and on the way we jack around funding. They're already losing some of the best and brightest minds. Remember when I asked you the last time we talked about this version of the bill, I said, do we really want our peers to be Alabama, Mississippi, and Missouri? No, we don't. We don't. But this bill puts us on that path. My understanding, and someone could correct me if I'm wrong, I think the funding formula puts this, the University of Minnesota at approximately 33% of what was available, and that the Min-State was at 67, I believe. If I'm wrong, someone can correct me, but that was my understanding when we walked out of caucus. This isn't a community college that's helping out a community get better with local regional labor needs, that's taking care of some kids that couldn't quite make it in high school, or people that find their way back there after getting tired of working minimum wage. This is a Tier 1 research institution that brings in the best and brightest minds around the world. And we treat it like it's a petulant child, and that is unacceptable. Does that mean that they don't make mistakes at times? For sure they do. They're a giant organization. Is there going to be some bad apples? I'm sure there is. We're watching and have went through some of those turmoils recently. Did they rightly get their hands slapped if not more, from the situation that happened with our psychology department? Absolutely. And was I in total agreement with that? I was, because they needed that. But the reality is that for every bad apple, there are groves of apple trees of good people doing good things at the University of Minnesota. Groves of them. But we focus on the one or two negative. I go back to my friend who's walking around today because of that cancer specialist. I watched numerous lives get changed at the University of Minnesota when I was there teaching. What they bring back to this state is almost beyond measure. And we act like there's some sort of ungrateful son that we don't want to give money to. That's just ridiculous. These are some of the brightest and best, most accomplished people in their field who've located in Minnesota, work at the University of Minnesota, and they work to make our state stay on the map. They bring in millions of dollars in research grants. They do amazing things in economics and robotics and in architecture and engineering, not to mention medicine. And here we are punishing them in this bill. This bill is punitive. I don't care what anybody says. This is a punitive bill. And it is unacceptable. It is unacceptable, and I'll say it to the governor, I'll say it to the majority leader, I'll say it to the speaker, and every Minnesotan that will listen. There isn't a clearer case in our behavior here of where we are cutting off our nose to spite our face by the way we've chose to address funding for higher education. Now, some of you might say, jeepers, we should get this passionate about health and human services, or K-12, or jobs. And I think we should. We should be this passionate about all of them. But for some reason, we're allowing this one to get kicked around again. Now, I get it. You're putting a little extra money in there, and that's not bad. That's good. But we have an opportunity to make it much better. We have an opportunity to tell Minnesota that we're making this priority, and we don't. No matter what argument is made today, at the end of the day, we have prioritized tax cuts ahead of the students of Minnesota. Let me make this clear if there's one thing anybody hears. The Republican Party, the Minnesota GOP, is raising the tuition at the University of Minnesota by starving them for funds, by not taking their responsibility seriously, by widening that gap of what the state responsibility is versus the student responsibility. There is no other way about it. It would be different if we had a tuition, if we had a deficit spending right now, but we do not. It'd be different if we had deficit spending, because then the cut would be warranted. We do not. Now they're going to have to raise their tuition 5 to 6%. Again, because we continue to disinvest in higher education in Minnesota. We continue to make our higher education system not a priority, which is what we're telling our students and our middle-class families that are struggling to get their kids through college, that they're not a priority. Folks, you need to take a stand at some point. I know the likelihood is pretty small. I've been around long enough, not that long, but long enough to know it's a futile effort. But I will continue, as long as I have breath, to continue to talk about this issue and tell people we are making a mistake. We have an opportunity to make this better, and we are not. And here's the problem, folks. You know what's going to happen after the bill gets signed? If it goes as it is now? Nothing. People are not going to feel it right now. But do you remember the metaphor I used last time? And I talked about how we disinvested in vocational education, and now 20 years later, we're sitting here with this real crisis of being able to find skilled labor? That metaphor is going to come true again, except you know what it's going to be? It's not going to be in the manufacturing sector. It's going to be in our voter turnout. It's going to be in our civic engagement. It's going to be in our ability to provide workers for Minnesota that are educated and at a high level. This generational problem is going to be much bigger next time, and there's no fixing that. Once we go down that rabbit hole, it is really hard to get back. Ask Alabama, ask Missouri, ask Mississippi. Do you think they like being last in all these rubrics? No, they don't. It's hard to get out of that. We're still there, and we have a chance to stay there. We have a rare moment to be proactive about a problem rather than reactive. We have a chance to get ahead of the 8 ball on this one, and we took a swing and missed completely. It is our responsibility. That's what we are elected to do. Our job is to make it so Minnesota is a better place when we're done, not worse. Period. That's our job. That's what we come here to do. This bill does not do that. This bill does not lower tuition in a way that's meaningful while allowing the state schools to be funded. This bill does not relieve student debt in a significant way. This bill does not make sure that we're investing in future technologies. This bill does not help us that way. It is token at best, and it is a disappointment. Shame on us as a state government for allowing this bill to become law. And I hope you take that seriously and think about it. Read the bill, ask questions, stand up for your local schools, stand up for your students, stand up for the middle class that's going to pay for the increased costs. Let us not forget, the Minnesota GOP is causing the University of Minnesota to raise its tuition. And I will be talking about that on Twitter and every place I go because that is the God's honest truth. Please vote no on this bill.